Welcome to the adventure of the Vanishing Vintner, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Lost Cases of Young Sherlock, before Baker Street, playing in the year 1874. Though these events occurred long before my own association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a remarkable collection of papers has recently come into my possession. Discovered within the archives of his old university friend Victor Trevor, these letters and journals chronicle the very genesis of his genius. They are in essence the lost cases of young Sherlock, before Baker Street, detailing his formative years when his singular methods were first tested. The first of these accounts, drawn from this unique record, is a most singular affair, which his friend titled, The Adventure of the Vanishing Vintner. Chapter 1. Our famous partnership at 221B Baker Street was still years away. Indeed, my name was not yet linked with his in any public fashion, but the singular talents of Mr. Sherlock Holmes were already sharpening within the venerable walls of Cambridge. I was newly returned from my service then, a man finding his footing, and his eccentricities were a welcome diversion. That crisp autumn term, with the air smelling of wood smoke and damp leaves, I first saw his methods applied to a true criminal puzzle. A knock at the door, hesitant yet insistent, broke the quiet. Holmes glanced up from a noxious chemical experiment. Its acrid smell stung my nostrils, and made me wonder about the safety of our floorboards. I opened the door to a portly gentleman puffing on the landing, his face a perfect mask of bewilderment. He clutched a hat in his hands, twisting the brim anxiously. "Mr. Holmes." "Aye. That is to say, a gentleman at the Blue Boar spoke of your remarkable talent for solving perplexing matters," remarked Mr. Josiah Plum. "I am merely a student of observation. The man at the pub exaggerates. Do come in, sir, and state your case. The fumes, I assure you, are largely harmless." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The man introduced himself as Mr. Josiah Plum, a local wine merchant. He settled into the armchair Holmes indicated, the wicker groaning in protest. I noted the tremor in his hands. This was a man pushed well past mere commercial frustration. "It is the most confounding thing, Mr. Holmes. I am plagued by a thief." "A thief, with the most appalling taste imaginable," Mr. Josiah Plum answered. "Appalling taste? Not a connoisseur, then?" observed Sherlock Holmes. "Far from it. On 3 occasions my cellars have been breached. He ignores my fine Bordeaux, turns his nose up at my best sherry. Instead, he makes off only with my cheapest, most dreadful stock," said Mr. Josiah Plum. "Cheapest? Define the term, if you would," explained Sherlock Holmes. "A Spanish red, sir. A truly dreadful vintage we call Castillo Rojo. It is crude, high in tannins, barely fit for cooking," Mr. Josiah Plum replied. "And someone is stealing that," responded Dr. John Watson. "Precisely, doctor. Crate after crate vanishes, while my treasures lie untouched. I sell it for pennies to the public houses. It is, to be frank, dross. Yet that is all he takes," Mr. Josiah Plum answered. Holmes leaned forward, his earlier languor vanishing. His half-closed eyes snapped open, bright and keen. As if by magic, the acrid scent of chemicals faded, replaced by the intoxicating aroma of a genuine mystery. "Fascinating. And you, Mr. Plum, are the sole purveyor of this Castillo Rojo in Cambridge," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The merchant blinked, the question clearly not one he had anticipated. He paused, his brow crinkling in thought. "Why, yes. Yes, I suppose I am. No other respectable merchant would dare stock it. I took on a massive consignment for a song years ago. That is why it is so perplexing. The constable says it is merely some drunkard. But why come only to me? Why steal only the worst I have to offer?" remarked Mr. Josiah Plum. "You ask the essential question, Mr. Plum, and you have already provided the answer. He comes to you precisely because you are the only source. The consistency is the key." Sherlock Holmes responded. I don't understand," remarked Mr. Josiah Plum. "This is not a crime of thirst, sir. It is one of purpose." "Thank you for bringing this most stimulating little problem to my attention. I shall look into it," explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose, a clear dismissal, and showed the baffled merchant to the door. I admit, I was as perplexed as our visitor. When the sound of Mr. Plum's heavy boots faded on the stairs, Holmes turned to me. A thin, eager smile played on his lips. The game, as I would hear him say so many times in the years to come, was afoot. For my part, I could not yet even see the board. The common room of our small society, which we had grandly christened the Dilettante Detectives Club, was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and old leather. A healthy fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. Holmes had been uncharacteristically quiet since our interview with the bewildered Mr. Plum, but I could see a familiar, intense light in his eyes. It was a look I was coming to recognize, one that promised a puzzle of the most intricate sort. "Gentlemen, I have a most peculiar problem to lay before you," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His voice, sharp and clear, cut through the low murmur of conversation. All eyes turned to him. I settled deeper into my armchair and prepared to take notes. Holmes proceeded to lay out the facts of the Vanishing Vintner with a precision that was entirely his own. The repeated thefts, the singular focus on the cheapest, crudest stock, and the complete disregard for the valuable bottles that lay mere feet away. When he had finished, a portly senior student named Davies took a long draw from his pipe and chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "My dear Holmes, the solution seems elementary. Some enterprising undergraduates have discovered a source of cheap intoxication and are simply helping themselves. Surely this is a matter for the proctors, not for us," responded Davies. A few heads nodded in agreement. A studious young man named Perkins adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed. Occam's razor, Holmes. The simplest explanation is most often the correct one." "Drunken students," said Perkins. Holmes's thin lips tightened into a faint, impatient smile. I could see he had anticipated this very line of reasoning, and was already prepared to dismantle it. "An appealingly simple theory, Davies, yet one that fails to account for the facts. Mr. Plum's establishment is not the only source of cheap drink in Cambridge. Why repeatedly risk breaking and entering for this specific, and by all accounts unpleasant wine, when public houses offer stronger spirits for a few pence, with far less trouble?" declared Sherlock Holmes. He paused, letting his question hang in the smoky air. The ticking of the grand mantel clock seemed to grow louder. Davies looked thoughtful, Perkins slightly affronted. Holmes had them. "No, we are looking at the problem from the wrong end. You ask who would want to drink such a vintage. The proper question is, what other purpose could this wine possibly serve? Let us set aside the notion of consumption. Consider what is truly of value here at Cambridge." Sherlock Holmes said. "Knowledge, then?" "A scholar's reputation," said Perkins. "Close, Perkins, but more tangible. The true currency of this university is credentials. A diploma from these halls is a key, a passport to a career in the colonial service, in government. Such a document is priceless to one who has not earned it," deduced Sherlock Holmes. "I confess, I failed to see the connection. How could a piece of paper and a bottle of foul wine be related?" Holmes, sensing our collective confusion, leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. He pressed on, connecting his points with startling clarity. "But Holmes, what has that to do with stolen wine? Forgery requires ink and paper, not a cheap vintage," Dr. John Watson added. "Precisely. But to forge such a document convincingly requires more. One might need to artificially age the paper, or to lift an authentic signature from one document to place upon another. Such delicate processes would require a chemical agent, a solvent with very particular properties," Sherlock Holmes noted. "It is my working hypothesis that the value of Mr. Plum's inferior wine lies not in its taste, but in its unique chemical composition. A composition perfect for a forger's intricate work." declared Sherlock Holmes. A stunned silence fell over the room. I looked at Davis, whose pipe had gone out forgotten in his hand. The trivial matter of stolen wine had, in a few sentences, been elevated to a conspiracy of sophisticated fraud. It was a breathtaking leap of logic, yet one that felt, impossibly, correct. This is no longer a simple puzzle for our club, it is a matter for the police, though I suspect they will require some convincing. "Come, Watson, we must pay a visit to Constable Grimsh," stated Sherlock Holmes. As Holmes and I made our way to the constabulary, a damp chill settled over Cambridge. Gas lamps cast wavering shadows on wet cobblestones. A distant dray horse's rhythmic clatter broke the town's studious quiet. Holmes walked with a brisk step, his chin sunk to his chest, his mind alight with the problem. His initial curiosity had sharpened into that focused intensity I was beginning to recognize as the prelude to action. The official mind, Watson, is a magnificent instrument for sorting that which is known. It is, however, utterly lost when confronted by that which is new, explained Sherlock Holmes. He offered this remark without breaking stride. We soon arrived at a squat brick building that seemed to absorb the light. Inside, the air was thick, with stale ink and carbolic soap, the silence broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the scratching of a clerk's pen, a sound like a trapped insect. We were shown into the cramped office of Constable Grimsh. He was broad of shoulder and red of face, his thick moustache failing to conceal a look of harried impatience. With a beefy hand, he gestured to two wooden chairs as papers rustled on his desk with profound irritation. "Mr. Holmes, I was told you might call. Come about the vintner's trouble, I suppose. A great deal of fuss over a few bottles of sour grape," responded Constable Grimsh. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of a man for whom trivialities were a personal affront. "It is precisely the sourness of the grape that interests me, Constable. Have you any leads?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "Leads?" he grunted, his chair groaning as he leaned back. "It's a petty theft. Student prank. Or that layabout Barnaby Fletcher after a free drink. We'll deal with it when we're not busy with real crimes. Burglaries and riots take priority, Mr. Holmes. I can't waste men hunting stolen vinegar," Constable Grimsh replied. "But surely, Constable, the point is that the valuable wines were ignored. That seems to me the most singular aspect of the affair," Dr. John Watson commented. Holmes gave me a brief, appreciative glance before turning his full attention back to the constable. He leaned forward, his expression one of almost academic patience, as if explaining a simple principle to a particularly slow student. "But you must see, that is the entire point. It is not what was stolen, but what was left behind. The thief ignored dozens of bottles of fine claret and port, wines worth a considerable sum, to select only the most inferior stock. This was not a crime of thirst, nor of profit. It was a crime of purpose," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The constable stared, his brow furrowed in simple incomprehension. He picked up a pen and examined its nib, a clear gesture of dismissal. "Purpose? The purpose was to get drunk for free, Mr. Holmes. You university men can spin theories from thin air, but my job deals with facts. The fact is, it's a trifling matter." "Now, if you'll excuse me," remarked Constable Grimsh. Holmes rose from his chair, a flicker of something, not anger, but a cool, analytic fire, in his grey eyes. He gave a curt nod. "I see. Thank you for your time, Constable. You have been most illuminating," replied Sherlock Holmes. We stepped back into the gathering dark, the station door closing behind us with a solid thud. The sounds of the street, a passing carriage, the distant cry of a vendor, rushed to fill the silence. For a moment, Holmes stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed upon the ancient stones of a nearby college. When the authorities are blind, Watson, it falls to the private observer to see. Grimsh is looking for a common thief, and so he shall never find our man. He seeks motive in the crime itself, when the true motive lies in what the crime makes possible. "We must return to the beginning," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "To Mr. Plum's?" responded Dr. John Watson. "To the cellar, Watson. The constable may be content with his ledgers, but I prefer the evidence of dust and dregs. The truth of this affair is written there, and I intend to read it," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Stung by the constable's condescension, Holmes was now a man possessed by a singular purpose. We returned at once to the premises of Mr. Josiah Plum, who led us, candle in hand, down a set of steep stone steps. A wave of cool, damp air, thick with the scent of earth and aging wood, met us at the bottom. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows across rows upon rows of racked bottles, their dark glass glinting like 1,000 watching eyes. The sound of our boots scraping on the flagstones and the faint, rhythmic drip of water from some unseen corner were the only intrusions upon the profound, almost sacred, silence of the cellar. "Here we are, Mr. Holmes. Just as I left it. See there? The Chateau Lafitte, untouched. The Sandeman's Port, safe as houses. But the Algerian Red, gone. It makes no sense. No sense at all," Mr. Josiah Plum answered. His voice, a booming lament, echoed slightly in the confined space. Holmes, however, paid him no mind. He had produced his pocket lens, and was already on his hands and knees, his sharp face illuminated from below by the candle he had taken from the merchant. He moved with a swift, silent intensity, his examination beginning not with the wine racks, but with the floor itself. He ignored the cobwebs and the patches of damp, his attention fixed upon the stone directly beneath the empty shelves. "Mr. Plum, have you had any work done down here recently? Masons, perhaps?" "Plasterers," stated Sherlock Holmes. The merchant looked bewildered by the question. Holmes did not wait for an answer, but instead pressed a long, pale forefinger to the floor. He brought it close to his eye, then held it out under the candlelight for my inspection. Upon the tip was a faint, almost imperceptible smudge of white powder. "Work? Heavens, no, not for years. That's just dust, my boy." "This is a cellar, after all," answered Mr. Josiah Plum. "It is not dust, sir. It is chalk. Specifically, the sort used on blackboards. Now, let us turn our attention to the crime itself," stated Sherlock Holmes. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, and directed his gaze to the racks. He pointed a decisive finger towards the empty slots where the cheap Algerian wine had once rested. Then his finger swept across to an adjacent rack, laden with dust-caked bottles of a far greater vintage. "You say they took your Algerian Red, a wine you sell for a few pence the bottle. And yet they left this, a Montrachet, if I am not mistaken?" "A wine worth more than the thief's weekly wage, I should wager," observed Sherlock Holmes. "Precisely. It is the work of a madman. Any common drunkard would know to take the best," said Mr. Josiah Plum. A thin, triumphant smile played upon my friend's lips. He turned from the wine rack to face us, his eyes burning with an intellectual fire that seemed to push back the cellar's gloom. "That, my dear Watson, is because our thief is no common drunkard. He steals not to drink, but to experiment," observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, letting the statement hang in the cool, damp air. Mr. Plum looked from Holmes to me, his expression a mask of utter confusion. "Mr. Plum, your cheapest Algerian Red. Thin, acidic, rich in tannins. It's a poor man's chemical reagent," stated Sherlock Holmes. He let the statement hang in the air, his gaze fixed on the merchant. The only sound was a single drop of water striking a puddle, a sharp counterpoint to Plum's bewildered silence. "Our culprit sought a specific compound found in this vintage. The chalk dust points to the university. Our thief, Watson, is no wine connoisseur, but rather a connoisseur of chemistry, a student perhaps, or even a don," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Mr. Plum stared, his mouth agape, the candle trembling in his hand and sending shadows leaping about the cellar walls. The simple theft of cheap wine had been transformed before his eyes into a matter of cunning and scientific purpose. Holmes, his theory now solidified, became all business. The when is now as important as the what. Mr. Plum, I must see your business ledgers. I need to establish a timeline to see when these specific purchases and subsequent thefts occurred. Your wife manages the accounts, I believe, observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes ascended from the cellar with a newfound energy, brushing the last of the chalk dust from his fingertips. The door to the back office creaked open to reveal a cramped space filled with the scents of old paper and ink. A tall case clock ticked methodically in the corner, its rhythm a counterpoint to the muffled sound of carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside. Mrs. Plum, your husband informs me that you are the sole custodian of the business ledgers. Might I impose upon you to see the records for the past 2 years? Replied Sherlock Holmes. Mrs. Martha Plum, a woman of quiet composure, retrieved 2 immense leather-bound volumes from a heavy oak cabinet, its lock turning with a dull click. The floorboards groaned softly under their weight as she placed them on the desk. Her movements were efficient, her expression unreadable. Everything is here, Mr. Holmes. Every purchase, every sale, every delivery. My system is quite particular, remarked Mrs. Martha Plum. Holmes gave a thin smile of appreciation and drew up a chair, its legs scraping briefly against the wooden floor. For nearly an hour, the only sounds were the rustle of turning pages and the scratch of his pen. I watched his eyes dart across the columns of figures, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, abruptly, he stopped, his finger tapping a single entry. Curious. Mrs. Plum, these dates of recorded loss, March the 3rd of last year and February the 28th of this. Do these periods hold any other significance for you? A local festival, perhaps? Sherlock Holmes said. She considered for a moment, her gaze distant. The ticking of the case clock seemed to grow louder in the expectant silence. No, sir. Not a festival. But it is the height of the examination season at the university. A stressful time. We often see an increase in sales of sherry and port, replied Mrs. Martha Plum. Holmes leaned forward, his voice acquiring a low, vibrant hum of excitement. But not of your cheapest stock, I take it. And what of this cluster of thefts in late September? Again, last year, and the year before, remarked Sherlock Holmes. That would be just before the Michaelmas term begins. It is when the final applications are due for the Indian Civil Service. A matter of great importance for many of the young gentlemen. It is the talk of the town, remarked Mrs. Martha Plum. With a sharp crack that made me start, Holmes slapped his notebook shut. His features lit up with profound satisfaction as he rose, offering a slight bow to the wine merchant's wife. You have been of immense help, madam. You have turned a key in this lock, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming. Watson, the pattern is no longer a mere suggestion. It is a certainty. The thefts are driven not by thirst, but by deadlines. The inferior wine serves not as a beverage, but as a tool, a chemical reagent, I suspect, for some nefarious purpose connected to official applications, Sherlock Holmes said. He began to pace the small office, his sharp, decisive footsteps echoing on the floorboards, mirroring the frantic energy of his thoughts. The academic connection was now cemented, but the precise nature of the forgery remained shrouded. We have gleaned what we can from the respectable face of Cambridge. Now we must consult its underbelly. We need a man who hears the gossip of the colleges, one who knows the petty secrets of the students. We need an informant, Watson, and I believe I know just the rogue to approach, observed Sherlock Holmes. The revelation from Mrs. Plum's ledgers propelled Holmes into immediate action. Leaving the scent of old paper behind, he led me not towards the grand colleges, but into the labyrinthine alleys that festered behind them. Here, the air was thick with damp coal and boiled cabbage. The proud chimes of the university bells sounded distant and muffled. From somewhere in the gloom came the scuttling of a rat, and a distant, angry shout echoed briefly. Water dripped with a steady, mournful rhythm from a rusted pipe overhead, splashing onto the greasy cobblestones. The criminal of real intellect, Watson, understands the value of camouflage. To find our man, we must look not amongst the obvious brutes, but amongst those who can move between worlds. Our quarry is one Barnaby Fletcher, known to the local constabulary as Nails, declared Sherlock Holmes. He spoke with a crisp certainty that cut through the oppressive gloom. I confess, the name meant nothing to me, but Holmes seemed to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of the city's underclass. He guided me into a narrow, lightless passage where the brickwork seemed to lean in upon us. A wiry figure detached himself from the shadows, his shoulders hunched. "Lost, are we, gents? This ain't the way to King's Parade," responded Barnaby Nails Fletcher. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, and his eyes darted from Holmes to myself, weighing us up. He shifted his feet, the scrape of his worn boots echoing slightly in the confined space. "We are precisely where we intend to be, Mr. Fletcher. I am not a constable. My interest is purely academic. It concerns wine," stated Sherlock Holmes. At the word wine, Fletcher's posture stiffened. A flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or cunning, passed across his face. "Know nothing about it. I'm a legitimate man of business," said Barnaby Nails Fletcher. "I am sure you are. Your business, as I understand it, involves procuring certain items for the young gentlemen of the university, items they might find difficult to acquire through official channels," replied Sherlock Holmes. Fletcher did not reply, but his gaze flickered towards the alley's exit, as if measuring the distance. The damp air seemed to grow colder. "Rest assured, I am not interested in their illicit tobacco or banned periodicals. My focus is singular, the very cheapest, most acidic red wine, the sort that has been disappearing from Mr. Plum's cellars." Sherlock Holmes responded. Holmes's tone was conversational, yet it held the cold weight of an accusation. He produced a shilling, which glinted in the faint light filtering from the alley's entrance. Fletcher's gaze fixed upon it. The man's resolve seemed to crumble. "Right then. No harm in talking, I suppose. Them young masters, they get ideas above their station. One of 'em was boasting in his cup, see? Overheard him talking to his mates about some clever scheme. Said the cheap plonk, the real gut rot, was the key. Reckoned it could. Wipe a slate clean, he did," answered Barnaby Nails Fletcher. "Wipe a slate clean? Elaborate man," observed Sherlock Holmes. "That's what he said, sir. Something about how it takes the ink right off the paper. Makes it look like it was never there. A brilliant trick for correcting mistakes." "That's all I heard, I swear it," replied Barnaby Nails Fletcher. Holmes flicked the coin towards Fletcher, who snatched it mid-air with practised ease. As we turned away, I caught sight of my friend's face. His brow was furrowed, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, almost predatory intensity. I could almost hear the click of puzzle pieces fitting together in that remarkable mind of his. "There we have it, Watson. It is, as I suspected, only more elegant. The wine is not a beverage, it is a chemical reagent," explained Sherlock Holmes. I stared at him, the informant's words about wiping a slate clean echoing in my ears. "A reagent? To do what? Surely not to alter examination papers?" asked Dr. John Watson. "No, far too risky. The papers are too closely scrutinized. The high tartaric acid content of the inferior vintage acts as a crude but effective ink remover. But for what purpose?" Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused, letting the question hang in the air as we walked. The answer, when it struck me, was as shocking as it was logical. "Good heavens! The application forms for the civil service," wondered Dr. John Watson. "Precisely. Submitted on university parchment, less guarded than the exams themselves. Our culprits are not common drunkards, but ambitious, desperate scholars," Sherlock Holmes noted. The pieces fell into place with a dreadful clarity. This was a crime born not of simple vice, but of the immense pressure to secure one's future. And that, my dear fellow, is a subject upon which we require an expert. Our next port of call must be Professor Finch, Sherlock Holmes said. Upon his return from the university, I found Holmes in a state of singular animation. His cheeks were flushed, and his eyes held that particular gleam which I had come to associate with the closing of a logical loop. He paced the length of our modest sitting-room with the caged energy of a greyhound, clearly forging the final chain of his reasoning. "Your excursion was a success, I take it?" commented Dr. John Watson. "More than a success, Watson. It was a confirmation. I've just concluded a most enlightening consultation with Professor Alistair Finch, the classics don, a man of immense intellect, and, crucially, vast experience with the peculiar pressures of academic life," Sherlock Holmes said. He stopped his pacing and fixed me with an intense stare. His voice dropped slightly as he began to recount his visit, with such clarity that I felt I had been walking beside him. He gestured as if setting a stage, and began his tale. The air in his study, Watson, was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax. A low fire crackled in the hearth, and the only other sound was the steady tick of a grand long-case clock. I presented my inquiry under the guise of a sociological study. Holmes relayed the conversation that followed, adopting a more measured, thoughtful tone as he quoted the old professor. "The pressures upon these young men, Mr. Holmes? They are beyond what most can comprehend. For many, a degree from this institution is not merely an education, it is the sole key to a future," remarked Professor Alistair Finch. Holmes paused, letting the weight of the professor's words settle in the quiet of our room. "It is the gate through which they must pass to secure a respectable post in the Indian civil service, a governorship in a distant colony, a place in Whitehall," Professor Alistair Finch said. "The entire machinery of empire, you see, is oiled by men with credentials such as ours. And if a young man, through lack of wit or application, found that gate about to be barred to him, what lengths might he go to, Professor, to force it open?" Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes described how the professor had risen and walked to his window, his voice dropping to a low, sombre register as he gazed out upon the manicured lawns. He might go to desperate lengths, when a man's entire future, his family's honour, and a life of consequence are weighed against a single piece of parchment. Professor Alistair Finch said, "My friend let the unfinished sentence hang in the air, a profound and terrible silence that filled our small room. Well, it can breed a most terrible and profane form of ingenuity. We have seen it before. We shall, I fear, see it again." Holmes fell silent, his point made with crystalline clarity. The motive, once speculative, now stood as an irrefutable certainty, a testament to the fierce ambition propelling the mighty engines of the British Empire. Good heavens, Holmes! So it is not about the wine at all, but about a credential? Forgery? Commented Dr. John Watson. Precisely. The theft of cheap wine was the absurd symptom of a profound disease. The how was provided by our friend Mr. Fletcher and his gossip of ink erasing. The why has been furnished by the good professor. All that remains is the proof, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. His energy returned in a flash. He grabbed his coat from its peg and a small, corked bottle from his evidence table. The cork squeaked softly as he worked it loose, and a sharp, acidic smell briefly touched the air. "And that, my dear Watson, requires not philosophy, but chemistry. The university laboratory awaits. We must demonstrate, with irrefutable science, how the vilest of vintages can become the most potent of criminal tools," remarked Sherlock Holmes. The interview with Professor Finch had lent a grim certainty to Holmes's theory. The stakes were not a few stolen bottles, but the very integrity of an imperial credential. It was with this weight upon my mind that I followed Holmes into the austere quiet of the university's chemistry laboratory. The air, cool and still, was tinged with the sharp, clean scent of alcohol, and a fainter, More acrid note I could not place. Rows of glass beakers and retorts gleamed under the gaslight, casting long, distorted shadows across the slate-topped benches. A low, steady hiss from a Bunsen burner was the only sound to disturb the scholarly silence. Holmes was already at work, his tall, gaunt frame hunched over a small porcelain dish. He had decanted a measure of Mr. Plum's foulest wine, the very vintage that had been stolen, and its sour vinegary odour now contended with the chemical sense of the room. With the delicate precision of a surgeon, he added a single drop of a clear reagent from a pipette. I watched, fascinated, as the murky red liquid in the dish immediately darkened to a near black. "Observe, Trevor." A most dramatic reaction. One would not expect such a spectacle from a wine fit only for the gutter, deduced Sherlock Holmes. "What does it signify, Holmes?" "It looks as though you have created a dish of ink," Victor Trevor answered. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. He set down the pipette with a soft click against the slate. "You are not far from the mark. In fact, your observation is the very key to this puzzle. This cheap wine is saturated with the harsh, bitter acids that give it such a dreadful taste. A fine vintner works to remove them. Our thief seeks them out," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He gestured towards the darkened dish, his voice growing animated with the thrill of explanation. "Now, consider the traditional ink of official documents. It is an iron-based ink, stabilized with the very same type of plant acids found in this crude wine. Our forger is not making ink, my dear Trevor. He is unmaking it. By carefully applying this acidic liquid, he can cause the ink on a genuine document to fade and dissolve, almost as if it were being chemically erased." As Holmes spoke, the disparate elements of the case coalesced in my mind, fitting together with an almost palpable sense of rightness. The sheer scientific elegance of the scheme was breathtaking. "Good heavens, Holmes! Then this vile vintage is not the prize at all, but rather the very instrument of forgery," Victor Trevor answered. "Precisely. A tool with a dual purpose. Once the old text is sufficiently faded, the high acid content of the wine can be used to artificially age the fresh parchment or vellum, giving it the brittle feel and yellowed patina of antiquity. Our criminal is not merely a thief, he is a chemist of considerable talent. He chose this specific worthless wine not in spite of its flaws, but because of them. It is the perfect chemical agent for his work," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He straightened up, his eyes gleaming with an intense predatory light. The case had transformed from a petty theft into a battle of wits against an unseen intellectual foe. We have established the motive and the method. The why and the how are now known to us. All that remains, Trevor, is the where. A forger of this caliber requires solitude, access to resources, and a place to conceal his craft. The time for chemical analysis is over. Now, we must hunt," observed Sherlock Holmes. He extinguished the Bunsen burner with a flick of his wrist, plunging our corner of the laboratory into deeper shadow. The hiss died, and the silence that rushed in felt charged with purpose. "Tomorrow, we shall turn our attention to the university's great library. If a man wishes to hide a leaf, he goes to the forest. If he wishes to forge a document, he would be a fool not to operate within the very shadow of the archives he seeks to emulate." Sherlock Holmes responded, following Holmes's conclusive demonstration. My mind reeled with the sheer audacity of the scheme. The heavy library door groaned shut, its thud swallowed by a profound silence. Dust motes danced in long shafts of afternoon light, piercing the gloom. The air hung thick with the scent of aged paper and leather. "Keep to the periphery, Victor." "We are not here to browse," Sherlock Holmes responded. His voice was a low command, barely disturbing the quiet. He moved with a predator's grace, his tall, thin form weaving between the towering stacks of knowledge. I followed, my own footfalls sounding clumsy and loud to my anxious ears. He led us not towards the bustling main reading room, but to a far-flung dusty corner, designated for archaic cartography. But Holmes, why here? Wouldn't a forger need books on calligraphy or chemistry, not dusty old maps? Victor Trevor answered. A common fallacy. The forger requires not instruction, but seclusion. He needs a place where a single student, working for hours, would arouse no suspicion. Here, amidst the forgotten and the esoteric, a man might labor for a week and be disturbed only by the mice. Sherlock Holmes responded. He stopped abruptly before a small, isolated carrel, a simple wooden desk and chair tucked into an alcove. It seemed unremarkable, coated in a fine layer of grey dust like all its neighbours. Yet Holmes's eyes, burning with a fierce intensity, were fixed upon its surface. Look closely. What do your eyes tell you? Explained Sherlock Holmes. I leaned forward, peering at the wooden top. I saw nothing but the faint scratches and stains of decades of use. I was about to confess my failure when my friend pointed with a long, slender finger. There. Not a stain, but a spatter. And another here. Too dark and crude for ink. It lacks the metallic sheen. These are the telltale marks of Mr. Plum's wretched claret, splashed during the delicate work of aging a document. Deduced Sherlock Holmes. He then knelt, his gaze sweeping the floor beneath the desk. He produced a pair of tweezers from his pocket, and, with the utmost care, plucked something nearly invisible from between the floorboards. It was a tiny, curled shaving of what looked like old parchment, the trimmed edge of a newly cut diploma, I fancy. Our man is skilled, but he is not infallible. He has left his spoor, explained Sherlock Holmes. As he spoke, a new sound broke the silence. The distinct, rhythmic tread of approaching footsteps from the far end of the aisle. They were slow and heavy. Holmes reacted in an instant, his hand grabbing my arm and pulling me with surprising strength into the deep shadow of a looming bookcase. We held our breath. The footsteps drew nearer, stopping beside the very carrel we had just examined. Through a gap in the ancient books, I saw two pairs of trousered legs. A low murmur of conversation reached us, the words indistinct, but the tone conspiratorial. One voice a rough baritone, the other a more cultured tenor. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the footsteps resumed their progress, moving away from us and fading once more into the vast, echoing quiet of the library. We remained frozen for a full minute after the last sound had died away. "Come, Victor, let us not press our luck," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He spoke in an urgent whisper, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. He had seen enough, heard enough. As we slipped from our hiding place and made for the exit, the pieces were no longer scattered in his mind. They were clicking rapidly into a coherent and startling picture. "Back to my lodgings, and quickly. The web is woven, and I believe I know the name of the spider at its center," replied Sherlock Holmes. The chill of the library stack still clung to my coat as I watched my friend Sherlock Holmes pace before the hearth in his modest Cambridge lodgings. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the persistent autumn rain lashing against the window panes, its drumming a stark contrast to the electric silence within the room. On a table pushed against the wall, a collection of glass beakers and test tubes stood in silent testament to his recent chemical inquiries, their faint, astringent scent mingling with that of his strong shag tobacco. Our near discovery in the library, Trevor, was no setback. Rather, it was the final piece of the puzzle. This affair hinges not on the what of the crime, but the when, explained Sherlock Holmes. He gestured towards a calendar pinned to the wall, upon which he had made a series of cryptic red marks. I could see no discernible pattern. "The timing, Holmes. I confess it seemed entirely haphazard. A bottle stolen in May, another in July. It appears to be the very definition of random pilfering," remarked Victor Trevor. A thin smile touched his lips. "On the contrary, your random pilferer, your common drunkard, does not confine his thirst to specific weeks of the year," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He tapped one of the red marks on the calendar with a long, slender finger. The date was just 2 days before the summer degree conferrals. "Each theft, my dear fellow, coincides precisely with the conferral of degrees or the official entry of examination results into the registry. They were preludes to acts of academic fraud, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He picked up a test tube containing a murky, reddish liquid, the dregs of Mr. Plum's infamous four-penny disaster. He swirled the contents, his expression one of intellectual satisfaction. Our informant was correct that Barnaby Fletcher was the hand that took the bottles, but he missed the purpose. This wine is not for drinking. Its value lies in its unique acetic properties. Acetic properties? You mean like vinegar? Victor Trevor said. Precisely. A weak, organic acid, potent enough to bleach the specific iron gall ink used on university parchments, yet gentle enough to leave the vellum itself seemingly unharmed. It is the perfect forger's solvent, deduced Sherlock Holmes. I gasped, my mind reeling. Before me, Holmes was weaving together the disparate threads, the worthless wine, the precise timing, our close call in the archives. A tapestry of audacious criminality took shape. Good heavens, Holmes, you cannot mean they are altering degree certificates, answered Victor Trevor. His voice was sharp, cutting through my astonishment. Precisely that. Creating credentials for those with deep pockets but shallow minds. But that leads to the final question, does it not? The one which has so troubled poor Mr. Plum. Stated Sherlock Holmes. Why him? I asked, my voice low. Why risk returning to the same merchant repeatedly? It seems an unnecessary gamble, answered Victor Trevor. Because it was not a gamble. It was a statement of pure intellectual arrogance. Our culprits reasoned that no one of authority would ever mount a serious inquiry into the theft of the cheapest, most wretched wine in Cambridge. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He set the tube down with a decisive click on the mantelpiece, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The very triviality of the crime was its most ingenious shield. They were hiding their scheme not in a shadow, but in a farce, confident that no mind of any merit would ever stoop to investigate it. He strode to his writing desk, the floorboards groaning faintly under his determined tread. The firelight cast his lean silhouette into sharp relief. The hunter, his quarry identified, was now preparing the snare. He drew out a sheet of crisp stationery, and dipped his pen in the inkwell. The scratch of the nib suddenly the loudest sound in the room. The web, Trevor, is fully spun. All that remains is to invite the spiders to a little gathering. I believe Mr. Plum's cellar would make a most appropriate venue for our final act. I watched, my heart beginning to pound with a nervous excitement, as he began to write. The time for deduction was over. The time for confrontation was at hand. I must confess, my friend's flair for the dramatic had never been more apparent. He had gathered us in a university administrative office, a room so solemn it felt more like a courtroom, all dark wood, and the scent of old paper. I watched our small assembly, Mr. and Mrs. Plum, huddled on a stiff settee, Constable Grimsh, a pillar of scepticism by the door, and Professor Finch, observing with academic detachment. And then there were the two junior bursars, a Mr. Davies and a Mr. Croft, looking utterly bewildered, having been summoned, I understood, to discuss a simple records discrepancy. Holmes stood before the hearth, his tall figure silhouetted against the empty grate. With the precision of a theatre director, he had orchestrated this gathering. Now, as he pivoted to face his captive audience, the air crackled with anticipation. The great detective was ready to begin his performance. Mr. Plum, your entire grievance was founded upon a perfectly logical, yet entirely flawed premise. You believed a thief had stolen your wine, declared Sherlock Holmes. But Mr. Holmes, the scoundrel took the bottles from my very cellar. How can you say it's not theft? Mr. Josiah Plum replied. Holmes held up a hand, a gesture intended to soothe the vintner's agitation. Plum fell silent, his mouth still half open to protest. He took your bottles, yes. But it was not the wine he was after. He sought the very thing that made it so wretchedly inferior, its high acetic acid content. "He did not steal wine, he stole a chemical agent," deduced Sherlock Holmes. A bewildered silence fell, broken only by the heavy tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I saw the confusion on Plum's face mirrored, to some degree, on the constable's. Holmes then shifted his gaze to the officer, his tone becoming a shade more pointed. "Constable Grimsh, you searched for a common drunkard or a petty thief, a man like Barnaby Fletcher perhaps. You sought a man who would steal for shillings, but the commodity here was not profit, but deceit," observed Sherlock Holmes. "Forgery? What has that to do with cheap wine?" Constable Grimsh said. It was the question Holmes had been waiting for. He turned now to Professor Finch, a flicker of academic respect in his eyes that I had seen him afford to very few. "That, Professor, is the exquisite centre of the puzzle. The acid in that dreadful vintage, when applied with heat and skill, serves to artificially age parchment and ink," replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused, letting the professor, a man of science, absorb the chemical implication. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. "It can turn a document created yesterday into one that appears to be decades old, creating the illusion of authenticity required for forging university credentials," replied Sherlock Holmes. I saw Professor Finch lean forward, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of intellectual discovery. Fascinating. The perfect organic solvent to degrade the sizing on the parchment without leaving obvious traces. "A devilishly clever application of basic chemistry," Professor Finch answered. A quiet gasp from Mrs. Plum drew Holmes's attention, and his tone softened as he turned to her. "And it was you, Mrs. Plum, who provided the final damning piece of the puzzle. Your ledgers are a model of clarity," stated Sherlock Holmes. Mrs. Plum looked from Holmes to her husband, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. The distant, rhythmic scratching of a clerk's pen from a nearby office was the only sound. They showed the thefts occurred not at random, but in the weeks immediately preceding the university's degree conferral ceremonies. "Those are the precise moments when fraudulent credentials would be most valuable," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. I watched in admiration as he constructed his argument with the precision of a master craftsman, giving each person the piece of the puzzle they were best equipped to understand. The tension in the room was a palpable electric thing. My gaze was drawn to the two bursars, Davies and Croft. They had been still as statues, but now I saw Davies swallow hard, a small, dry sound that seemed to echo in the charged silence. It was upon that sound that Holmes pivoted. He took 2 steps forward, and his voice, when he spoke again, was no longer academic but as sharp and cold as steel. An operation requiring intimate knowledge of university schedules, access to student records, and a need for secrecy. All paths lead back to this very building. To the office responsible for the very documents being forged. "Is that not so, Mr. Croft?" observed Sherlock Holmes. I saw Croft's face pale, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. Holmes then shifted his piercing stare to the other man. "And you, Mr. Davies, I believe this ink stain on your cuff will match precisely the unique chemical signature of the ink used on the forged diplomas, and the residue of Mr. Plum's very worst vintage," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Croft's face went white as chalk. Davies, however, made the fatal error. I saw the panic flash in his eyes before, with a strangled cry, he lunged for the door, knocking over a small table with a crash of splintering wood and scattering papers across the floor. The trap, so carefully laid by my friend, had been sprung. The chaos following Holmes's startling revelation subsided as quickly as it had erupted. With the constabulary having led away the disgraced academics, a profound silence fell upon the wine merchant's shop, and I confess, I breathed a sigh of relief myself. The air, which moments before had been electric with accusation, now seemed to hum, with a quiet sense of justice restored. Mr. Plum, his face a mask of astonishment transformed into profound relief, bustled behind his counter. "Mr. Holmes, I am utterly flabbergasted. To think such a nefarious scheme was fermenting beneath my very nose. This calls for a toast with our finest vintage, does it not?" said Mr. Josiah Plum. He produced a dust-caked bottle and 2 gleaming glasses, his hands trembling with emotion as he worked the cork. The rich, deep pop echoed in the stillness, a sound of pure vindication. I watched Mrs. Plum, ever the more composed of the pair, step forward, her ledger held not as a weapon of business, but as a token of gratitude. She was the anchor in their storm. "Mr. Holmes, we are profoundly in your debt. You perceived a calculated design where we could only see common pilfering. In our profession, one's reputation is as precious as the finest vintage. You have preserved ours, and for that we offer our most sincere gratitude," responded Mrs. Martha Plum. "The credit belongs to your ledgers, Mrs. Plum. The pattern was there, waiting to be read. The cheapest stock, the Vander table, contains specific acids. It was these acids the forgers required to artificially age their documents. Fine claret would have been of no use to them. You see, it was never about the wine itself, but its chemistry. A straightforward matter, once one eliminates the impossible," stated Sherlock Holmes. He accepted the glass Plum offered, but I saw he merely studied the deep ruby liquid, his mind already moving beyond the confines of the little shop. It was ever his way. After a few more minutes of heartfelt thanks, we took our leave, and the cheerful chime of the shop bell sounded to my ears like a final, pleasant punctuation mark to the entire affair. As the clock tower chimed 3, Holmes and I found ourselves strolling with Professor Finch across the university grounds, a crisp autumn wind nipping at our heels and rustling the golden leaves overhead. "A remarkable performance this morning, Holmes, truly remarkable. You possess a singular apparatus of the mind that we academics lack. We build our arguments ex fontibus, from the sources, brick by brick. You, however, seem to conjure your conclusions from the very air itself," answered Professor Finch. "Not from the air, Professor. From observation. People see, but they do not observe. The distinction is of critical importance. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes," replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his keen grey eyes scanning the ancient stone walls around us. I wondered what he saw, not just the history of the college I felt, but the countless unseen dramas the stones had witnessed. A distant chapel bell began to toll the hour, its solemn notes drifting across the courtyard. Perhaps. But to know what to observe, that, my boy, is the true gift. I suspect this university will not hold you for long. Your field of study is not the past, but the present. It is the great, messy, wonderful city of London that will be your true alma mater," Professor Finch answered. "You may be right, Professor," declared Sherlock Holmes. A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. "A rare sight that I treasured." He said nothing more. But I had the distinct impression that in resolving the vintner's curious problem, my friend had not merely solved a case, but had found a clearer vision of his own unique path. It was a path I knew, with absolute certainty, I would be privileged to walk alongside him, wherever it might lead.